I have the great pleasure and privilege to introduce Shashi Tharoor today, who I count as a good friend in Delhi, but who is one of the great Renaissance men of modern India, and has led multiple lives in remarkably fast pace. One of the leading novelists of his generation. His book, The Great Indian Novel, is a landmark literary work written in his 20s?
Early 30s.
By which stage he had already had a PhD at the age of 22. Went on to dazzling heights in the UN, nearly became, or stood for, Under-Secretary General or Secretary General?
No, I stood for Secretary General. I was Under-Secretary General.
You were Under-Secretary General and stood for Secretary General.
But close but no cigar, as Groucho Marx would say. Didn't make it.
Then returned home to enormous celebrity as a Congress politician in India, but Shashi, I think it's fair to say, is not naturally built for the constrictions of some aspects of modern Indian politics, where the last 2 or 3 Indian prime ministers prior to Mr. Modi have been almost completely silent and never say anything. Shashi, by contrast, has, he told me this morning, 3.2 million Twitter followers and broadcast to them on a very regular basis, often providing a certain self-generated turbulence to your own political career, I think it's fair to say.
Fair to say.
Perhaps you might quote a couple of your more famous tweets that's got you in trouble over the years.
No, the worst one probably was the one in which a journalist rather mischievously asked, when our government had announced an austerity drive, I was a minister in the government, "Mr. Minister, does this mean you will now travel cattle class?" To which I replied, "Absolutely, in cattle class, out of solidarity with all our holy cows," which I thought was relatively harmless, but it led to uproar. Not so much, you might be surprised to know, about the holy cows part, but actually about my using the expression cattle class, which they decided was unworthy of a minister of the government of India, because it implied I was equating economy class travellers to cattle. And while I tried to explain till I was blue in the face that this was an extremely common expression, and that in fact it was targeting the airlines for herding us all in like cattle rather than the passengers themselves, it led to rather eminent members of my own party calling for my resignation, and a general kerfuffle that lasted for some time.
And how many times have you got yourself sacked because of your tweets?
I'd rather not count, but anyway.
But he always comes back. He always comes back. And I'm not flattering him at all to say that he stands out head and shoulders above his rather timid contemporaries as an enormously intelligent, colourful, eccentric and controversial figure.
Not adjectives calculated to advance my career, as you can see.
But exactly, I mean, and it is a comment, in a sense, on the state of the current Congress party, which is not known for its particular welcoming of criticism, particularly of its leadership, I think it's fair to say. I would ask you to comment on that. That you currently remain, despite the fact there are only 44 Congress MPs left, you remain without a shadow ministerial portfolio.
But we don't have that system, you see. No one has a shadow ministerial portfolio because we don't allocate them. But in fact, I chair the Foreign Relations Committee, which is not a bad thing, because only 8 opposition MPs chair committees. The rest are all with the government. So, I'm not too unhappy with my current role in Parliament. And the committee, in any case, is where you get much more work done. So, no complaints.
But most recently, and this is not on the agenda of this talk officially, but I think it would be remiss not to start with this, Shashi has come to international prominence in the most unlikely circumstances of just joining a Oxford Union debate, which I turned down, having already done it with you in the Supreme Court in September, which in retrospect was a huge mistake, because this has become a kind of sort of epoch-making event. And Shashi's argument that the British Empire so impoverished India that the least we could do would be pay token moral reparations of £1 a year for the next 200 years, not only won the debate, but went on to become an incredible viral. It made even Mari Black's maiden speech look. Mari Black, we had 12 million retweets. You had
No,
Sorry.
on YouTube it's had about 3.5 million
Sorry,
views.
she had 1 point. What she had? Yeah.
She had 1.2.
1.2, and you had 3 million retweets of your speech. Just perhaps, I mean, I think in this country it's fair to say that we're brought up with, certainly we have an education system which teaches us that many wicked things happen in by European nations abroad, but largely it was Nazis oppressing other peoples, and that we grew up with a rather fond idea that the British Empire was a relatively benign affair, that we built railways, that we weren't as bad as the Belgians, and were a lot better than those horrible Germans. You gave a slightly different spin to things.
You certainly weren't as bad as the Belgians, but that's a terribly low yardstick, I'm afraid, because of what they did in the Congo. No, I mean, my argument is very simply that the prosperity of Britain over the last 200 years was built on its depredations, on Britain's depredations in India. That Britain came to a prosperous India, which accounted for 23% of global GDP, and left it accounting for 4%. It destroyed Indian industry, which was principally textile manufacturing, by smashing the looms of the famous Bengal weavers who wove muslin as fine as the woven air, it was said. Smashed their thumbs, absolutely, smashed their thumbs, broke their looms, and imported into Britain Indian raw materials such as cotton cloth and so on, and then exported the proceeds back to India. So India sank from having 27% of world exports to 2% by the time the British left. Frankly, dipped outrageously into the Indian treasury to prosecute the 2 world wars. It's been calculated that the sum total of material resources, not just the men, of whom there were very large numbers in both world wars, but the material resources spent by the Indian public and Indian taxpayers in everything from cash to clothing to munitions, animals, food, for the First World War alone amounts to £8 billion in today's money. There was also the tragic cost of the totally unnecessary famines visited upon India and British rule. Something like 15 to 29 million Indians lost their lives during these years of British rule, including most egregiously the Great Bengal Famine of 1943.
Which you better explain because it's
well, this was during the Second World War, when a totally unnecessary famine was created by Winston Churchill's decision to divert food supplies from starving Bengalis to Tommies in Europe who didn't actually need them because they actually went into European reserve stockpiles. And Churchill actually said, unbelievably enough, that the starvation of anyway underfed Bengalis mattered a good deal less than that of sturdy Greeks. That's an exact quote.
And why wasn't Gandhi
Well, that was the last thing. When appalled British officials, as people were dying around them like flies, sent messages back or telegrams back to London saying that these policies were costing lives and could they reverse the policies, Churchill's only comment was to write peevishly in the margin of the file, "Why hasn't Gandhi died yet?" So, to suggest that this was benign imperial conduct, this was typical, of course. The language and the extremism were typical of Churchill, but the conduct, I'm sorry to say, was typical of all colonial enterprises. The Jallianwala Bagh massacre, more simply known as the Amritsar massacre, which took place in 1919, was another terrible example. Mahatma Gandhi had supported India's supporting Britain in the First World War in exchange for what we expected would be Dominion status. And there was a declaration made by the Secretary of State for India, the so-called August announcement, the year before the war ended in 1917, saying that at the end of the war, Britain would grant progressively responsible self-government. Instead of which, Britain rewarded India with at the end of the war with extremely stringent acts called the Rowlatt Acts, which made arrest and detention without trial so much easier, censored the Indian press, all sorts of things. And anyway, to cut a long story short, protests against this led to even more repressive measures. And in the town of Amritsar in Punjab, General Dyer ordered that on a particular street where it had been said that an English woman had been assaulted, that every single Indian would have to crawl on all fours down the street. Now, this happened, went on for a few days, and a large number of unarmed Indians gathered in an enclosed garden to protest this. Not one of them carried a weapon of any sort, not even a stick, let alone a gun. And Dyer surrounded the enclosed garden and opened fire. Every single bullet claimed a victim. 1,700 odd people were killed. A further 1,300 were severely wounded. It was just something that, in many ways, dramatized the worst that colonialism could be. Now, I'm not suggesting that everything was like that, but there were these episodes, and colonialism and imperialism made them possible. On top of that, of course, you've got the fact that the arguments made for Britain are actually rather specious. The railways you mentioned. Well, the railways were a wonderful colonial scam, William. The railways were built
Invented by wonderful Scot Lord Dalhousie and exporting lovely engines from Glasgow to chug you through the countryside.
Well, not chug us through the country, chug the British through the countryside, and to take Indian raw materials to the ports to ship them to England. The railways were not built in terms of response to supply and demand of the Indian public. They were built to serve British imperial interests. And what's striking is that they were also done on the basis of such outrageously generous terms to British investors that it was actually ready money. It was the single most profitable investment available to the British public for about 3 decades, during which time the interest rates were so high, paid for entirely by Indian taxes, that a mile of railway in India cost more than double the same mile of railway in Australia and Canada. And what's more, at the time the expression used was this was private enterprise at public risk, but it was British private enterprise at Indian public risk. So even the railways, yes, we're happy to have the railways now, but we know why they were built and who they were built for. And the same applies to everything else. I mean, it's a bit rich after 200 years of enslaving, imprisoning, torturing, maiming, blowing people off the mounts of cannons, as happened after the so-called Indian Mutiny, all of that, some British people celebrate the fact that India is democratic at the end of it. Well, no, thank you. We had to seize that democracy for ourselves.
If there's any lingering empire nostalgists in the audience, please save this for question time, and you come back. I'm not going to argue with Shashi on this one, since I substantially agree with him. But I would be disappointed if we don't have a few die-hard Tweedy questions, please, from the audience before the evening's out. Now, this is, in an odd sort of way, got you in trouble yet again with your bosses, because it was praised by your enemy, Mr. Modi of the BJP,
the Prime Minister,
the man who just wiped out your party. Has that made life difficult?
Well, I mean, the fact is that I don't think there's anything that I said that anybody in my party disagrees with.
No fan letters from Sonia, though.
No, not too many fan letters, but I don't think there's any opposition hostility to it. However, the BJP Prime Minister chose at a public event, well attended by media, to express his appreciation of these remarks, and that, needless to say, in the hothouse world of Indian politics, Indian media immediately generated speculation that I was about to jump ship or whatever.
Can I give you the opportunity to deny this?
Totally. I mean, anyone who'd suggest that I would go off and join the BJP not only doesn't know me, but hasn't read sort of my rather extensive paper trail. I mean, I've published 15 books. They embody a set of values, particularly about Indian pluralism, which are at odds with everything that Mr. Modi and the BJP stand for.
So to explain to an audience who may not know the minutiae of Indian politics, in the last general election, India suffered as great a sea change as Scotland has just done in its last general election. In exactly the same way that the Labour Party was wiped out here, the Congress Party was wiped out. And from what was the highest number of seats the Congress Party ever had?
Oh, at its peak, I mean, Rajiv Gandhi had as many as 413 in a 543-member parliament.
And now 44.
But yes, this is much lower than the lowest we've ever had.
Could you talk about why you think that happened? Why did the party you represent
Well,
suffer
there were a
this
number of factors.
terrible-
I mean, the negative factors were, first of all, anti-incumbency, which is a classic feature of Indian electoral behavior. Throw the rascals out is the reflex.
And in this case, there was a massive series of corruption.
Well, I'm coming to
scandals.
that in a minute. But anti-incumbency as a general principle, because in the US, for example, to the US House of Representatives, the US Congress, the average re-election rate in the last 50 years is 96%. Whereas in India, to the Lok Sabha, the average re-election rate is 26%. So it's a miracle to get re-elected, by and large. And there are a few who managed it several times.
Does that just imply, though, that more MPs are busy feathering their nests than
That's part. And then secondly, you're quite right, corruption became a big issue. There was a very popular mass movement led by a saintly Gandhian figure, which brought the center stage. He had saturation coverage on television. And so people were very conscious of it. And not that the Congress Party is any more corrupt than the BJP or anyone else, sadly, in the very corrupted world of Indian politics. It's simply that being the ones in power, they got tarnished with that particular brush much more than the opposition did. The opposition represented the hope of change. The government seemed to embody, in the eyes of these people, what was wrong with the system. So corruption didn't help. Inflation didn't help. When the Congress Party came to power, when the UPA, the United Progressive Alliance, of which we were the centerpiece, came to power, oil was $40 a barrel. And the Indian rupee was 40 to the US dollars. And $1 US was 40 Indian rupees. By the time the UPA finished, oil was $140 a barrel, and the rupee had gone down to 60, which meant that the increase in price of each dollar was costing the Indian consumer 50% more. And it had gone up by $100. You can imagine that just passing the government tried to absorb some of this, but passing it on to the consumer turned everybody against us. I mean, I've had exchanges on Twitter with people saying, if the oil price goes up once more, if the petrol price goes up once more at the pump, I'm voting for the BJP. And I reply saying, do you think the BJP could do any differently? But anyway, we did lose those votes. And finally, there were a lot of...
Why is Indian politics as corrupted as it is? Because it is very low on the Transparency International level of corruption.
It's very, very troubling, and I'm not sure there's any easy answer to it, because it's certainly grown in the years. I left India after college, went abroad, did my doctorate, and then joined the United Nations. And I've only just come back to India in the last 6 years, and I'm horrified by what I see, because it's much, much worse than the India that I grew up in. Part of it definitely is politics itself, and politics has become the fount of corruption precisely because of our own desire to be shall we say, equitable. And the whole idea is the official ceiling on how much you can spend per candidate in an election is deliberately kept very low, many would argue unrealistically low, in order to ensure that anybody can contest an election. But the problem then is that what people actually spend, or their parties spend, or their supporters spend on the election,
it's usually more.
Is not just more, it's 20 times more. It's very often 30 times more. And all that extra money has to be unaccounted for. In other words, there's what we call black money sloshing around the system at election time.
And in the last
that
election,
has to be generated in order to be able to spend it.
In the last election, overwhelming, huge corporate support for Mr. Modi, with massive posters, every single poster slot across India.
It's been estimated that the Indian election, that the BJP's election budget was comparable to the entire cost of the US presidential election in just straightforward conversion terms, not purchasing power parity. In other words, it was over $1 billion was estimated. Now, during elections, that's a huge spurt to the economy, but it's also, I'm afraid, an awful lot of corruption. So that's political corruption. Then there's corruption at other stages, our bureaucratic processes. Unfortunately, people like to profit from the power to permit. So the more regulations there are, you can actually collect something to permit or to make an exception
Raj,
for.
as it's called.
Liberalization that the Congress Party introduced in 1991 is reducing the number of permissions required, but there are still too many. And then, of course, you've also got corruption in things like real estate transactions. Nobody anymore sells or buys a piece of land or a house or a flat at the actual value. I mean, I shouldn't say nobody, but large numbers of people don't. What they do is they declare a lower value so that the stamp tax payable is that much lower and so on, and they pay the rest in black money. Now, all these practices have generated a parallel economy, which some would argue is as large as the real one. So if India claims that its total GDP today is about $2 trillion, which is what we claim, the reality may well be 4. But the fact is that it's because so much of it is unaccounted for in this rather sleazy way.
Now, the election of Modi let onto the stage in India a man from a very different background to most of India's previous leaders. Like Nehru, most in the past, embracing a leftist agenda, and Modi, born and brought up in the RSS, an extreme right-wing organization modeled on the kind of Hitler Youth and the Phalange movements and fascist movements of the 30s. What do you think he represents for India, and why suddenly have Indians overwhelmingly embraced this ideology, which is so different from everything?
They haven't embraced the ideology. What's interesting is, yes, he came from this background, but became chief minister of a state. Chief minister is the state equivalent, what the Scots call first minister. So he became chief minister of the state of Gujarat.
We don't regard ourselves as a region, we regard ourselves as a country.
Well, there you are. Right. As I said, it's our equivalent of a first minister, but anyway. As chief minister, he actually developed a reputation for being an efficient and relatively honest administrator, as well as somebody who was committed to making it easier for businessmen to come in and invest and grow the economy, so that in fact the rate of growth in Gujarat was rather healthy. And in the campaign, he actually sold himself much more as somebody who could be trusted to help India's economy grow, rather than as somebody who was pushing the Hindutva agenda, the Hindu chauvinist agenda, if you like, which the RSS...
And in fact barely mentioned religion or Islam or Muslims or the minorities at any point in
I
the
think
campaign.
he did make enough nods and allusions to that agenda for the faithful. But his overall message was one of he would be the CEO India was lacking. And he contrasted himself to the outgoing prime minister, who was a gentleman by then in his early 80s, very soft-spoken, in fact.
Totally silent.
Sometimes silent. Very respected economist, but not somebody who could be seen as sort of inspiring the masses, whereas Modi is a very eloquent speaker in Hindi.
And honestly, didn't you feel that the last Manmohan Singh administration was a complete car crash? He was seen to be weak. He was seen to be dominated by Sonia, who wasn't elected. It was a catastrophe.
Well, with hindsight, one could say, at the time it didn't feel like that, but it did feel as if an awful lot of things weren't being done that could have been, and a lot of things, we were doing that we shouldn't have. So yes, I can't say it was the best possible time, but the results on the ground were actually not bad. I've got a piece up on the BBC site from Manmohan Singh's 80th birthday a couple of years ago, when they invited me to assess his tenure, in which I've argued that he's actually made a lot of very, very positive changes for India. And I was credibly able to argue that the lives of Indians were better for the 10 years of Manmohan Singh's prime ministership in demonstrable, provable ways. I won't waste everyone's time.
But to quote, in a sense, a different side of things, towards the end of Manmohan Singh's reign, the celebrated Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen with Jean Drèze produced a remarkable book of statistics on the Indian economy. And I'll just read some of the things, because this came on the background of a period when, under Manmohan Singh, India had been growing at 9%, was hailed as the new potential superpower. There were stories of how it had gone in a few years from 3 to 100 million cell phones, from the 100 million engineers a year were being produced in Indian universities. But suddenly, Manmohan Singh started pointing out things like the fact that a quarter of Indians were still illiterate, a third were without electricity, and half didn't have toilets in their house. And so there was a large-scale feeling that India, which had built itself up to believe that it was imminently becoming a superpower, felt enormously disappointed. Is that fair?
Well, first of all, I never quite believed the superpower nonsense. As I pointed out a few years ago in one of my many controversies, I said, how can we be a superpower when we're still super poor? The fact is, we have all these challenges. But, if you look at those numbers, you have to ask where we came from.
69% of Indians live on less than $1 a day.
That's right, but it was 90% when the British left in 1947.
That was
below the poverty
ago.
line. I know, but the poverty line is below $1 a day. So, in fact, if you look at the poverty line, it's now 27% from the 90 it used to be. Similarly, British left us with 17% literacy. The fact that it's now 75 is actually a vast improvement. It's not good enough. It's not nothing. There's no grounds for complacency, but there has been progress made, and that's the point I keep saying. You know, Manmohan Singh's economic policies pulled about 10 million people a year out of poverty. Now that's not inconsiderable. It's dwarfed by China, but no other country in the world comes close in terms of success in tackling poverty.
How would you rate, it's now a year into Modi's rule, how would you rate his performance in a year? A long time in politics.
Yeah, well, there's this wonderful Texan expression, you know, all hat and no cattle. And I think that's unfortunately what we see with Mr. Modi. He is somebody who really talks a good game. He's a wonderful speaker in Hindi, fluent, compelling, full of ideas. There's nothing particularly wrong with what he says. In fact, he's been careful not to put a foot wrong, not to live up to the stereotypes we all painted of him as this demon who was going to be bashing the minorities and who was going to be hostile and divisive. His language has been, in every respect, exemplary. But it's simply not been followed by any credible action. In fact, the gap between his rhetoric and the reality on the ground, the announcement of impressive schemes without a credible budget, an implementation plan, an execution capacity to actually get them done, all of this has actually caused more disappointment than if sort of a relatively silent prime minister had bumbled on, because you know you don't raise people with these soaring heights of rhetoric and then let them down by failing to deliver anything on the ground.
A year ago, it looked as if your party was completely sunk. It had had its worst ever historic election result. A year on, are you feeling a little bit more hopeful?
Oh, very much so. I mean, I think if he carries on like this, and we're only a year into a 5-year term, if he carries on like this, I can't see him going back credibly to the electorate and asking for a second term. I mean, there's literally not one of his campaign promises has moved on at all. I mean, he won a lot of votes by promising young people jobs. He's done absolutely nothing to generate new jobs in the economy. He's talked about various schemes, but most of these are existing schemes of our government repackaged, with undoubtedly more attractive labeling and you know, sound bites and photo ops, but without any substantial difference, and in many cases with lower budgets that have been allocated to them by our government.
If I was a BJP MP trying to explain away the lack of action by Modi, one of the defences surely I would mount against you would say that your party has behaved in a very disruptive manner in Parliament and has been carrying placards and protests into the Lok Sabha. How would you reply to that? And therefore obstructing the possibility of him passing any laws.
That's true, and I truly regret that the Congress Party is emulating the BJP's own behaviour in opposition. The new golden rule in our politics appears to be do unto them what they've done unto you. So this has been going on and it's not healthy. But having said that, there are a lot of things that don't require legislative action that Mr. Modi hasn't done. There's a great deal of regulatory action. For example, he makes a big fetish out of the importance of the ease of doing business. He's frequently said in his campaign speeches and since becoming Prime Minister that it's a shame that India is 142nd in the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index, and he wants to see it going up to at least 50th, he says. But the fact is that he's actually not rewritten a single regulation, simplified a single rule, removed a single onerous requirement. He makes a pretty speech 11 months ago bemoaning the fact that it takes an Indian 200 steps and permissions to actually open a store. And he points out that in America it only takes 6. Well, 11 months later it still takes 200. He's done nothing about actually following up on his brilliant insight. It's sort of almost like, you know, somebody gives him a soundbite, he thinks it's a great idea, he speaks it, he gets the soundbite and moves on to the next soundbite. So the country has to change, and he's squandering this extraordinary majority he won in the last election.
How big a threat to India's pluralism do you think Hindutva and the RSS really represents? India is this incredibly diverse country with so many different religions, so many different ethnic groups and languages, and yet he is often perceived as being very much behind the right wing of the Hindu majority.
That's right.
Very famously refused to wear a Muslim skull cap at any point in the election campaign, or do anything to win over the Muslims. Do you think that's been overplayed? Because we've seen a few church burnings, the odd religious riot, but nothing compared to the sort of thing that was going on in the 1980s.
Well, first of all, there's no question that the RSS does stand for this sort of thing. There are, if you like, two ideas of India. There's the idea best encapsulated by Jawaharlal Nehru and by most of the founding fathers of the freedom movement, who really saw India as a land for everybody, and particularly in the face of a separatist movement that led to the creation of Pakistan as a state for India's Muslims, we never fell into the trap of arguing that therefore what remained was a country for India's Hindus. We insisted that Muslims were just as welcome as indeed were anybody else who belonged or chose to belong to India's soil. And so indeed we have this rich diversity and plurality.
Although
in India.
in practice, for example, my middle-class Muslim friends in Delhi find they can only rent houses in certain colonies where other Muslims live, that on a general social level, it's still difficult.
That varies.
to
Again,
be,
there are enlightened landlords and there are bigots, but that's true, sadly, in every country. Perhaps Muslims face it worse because of the ever-present threat from Pakistan and the fear of that you might be renting your apartment to somebody who's incubating a bomb. I mean, all this nonsense. But I'm just saying there is that kind
fear.
of bigotry or fear as well, and that makes it worse. But it's by no means universal. However, it's real. At the same time, there are very many prominent Indians in every walk of life who are Muslim. We've had 2 presidents who are Muslim. We've had all our top movie stars, a couple of our cricket captains.
One of your big tech guys,
One of Azim Premji, who
yeah.
was briefly India's richest man, now is second or third. So it's not that we don't have, I mean, that Muslims lack opportunity to rise in India, and they do so and they can, but I agree with you that we're far from perfect and there are problems. Nonetheless, this pluralism and diversity goes to the heart of one idea of India. And then you've got this other idea of India that the RSS, which Mr. Modi belonged to from the age of 17, I think it was, profoundly believes in. And this is an organization that argues that India is fundamentally a Hindu nation, that everyone in it lives on the sufferance of the Hindus and must acknowledge their Hindu-ness in order to be allowed to remain, which is a preposterous idea to many of us, but which is at the core of their beliefs. And they tend, unfortunately, to ally these beliefs to a sort of martial spirit. They have these units with young men in khaki shorts parading with bamboo staves every morning at 6 o'clock.
Which is based on the Hitler Youth originally.
But yes, I mean, they argue, this is because I've made this argument myself, that this is based on the fascist movements of the 1920s and 30s. They argue, and it's not inaccurate, that they actually modeled on Baden-Powell's Boy Scouts, which they also wore khaki
which is, I think,
shorts.
the model for the Hitler Youth.
The khaki shorts. Well, so the question is it the Boy Scouts or is it? But anyway, I'm afraid the British colonial police also wore khaki shorts. So we can debate this. But anyway, the fact still is, nonetheless, that the implied threat of a sort of militarized, chauvinistic, Hindu nationalist force in power. And it goes beyond just being in power. It then influences other things, other appointments, for example, because the patronage network is vast. We've had the Indian Council of Historical Research, a number of cultural bodies, and so on, all being replaced, not just infiltrated. People have been asked to resign from these positions and are being replaced by people who have actually served in the RSS. That's been their principal qualification. We have the National Book Trust, for example, which is headed by an Indian novelist with 17 novels to his credit. He was asked to step aside and was replaced by the former editor of the RSS House magazine, who had no book to his credit, and he's now the head of the National Book Trust. I mean, this sort of thing is very worrying. And universities, museums, you name it. I mean, all sorts of things. And Mr. Modi himself has condoned some of the most outrageous minority baiting statements by prominent members of his party, including 2 members of his Council of Ministers and some of his prominent MPs. And he's himself not said a wrong word since becoming Prime Minister.
Give an example of the sort of things
Yeah, well, I mean, there's one chap said that anybody who doesn't support Mr. Modi should move to Pakistan, thereby implying they'd have to be Muslim to do that. And this chap is a Minister of State. Another Minister of State said that it was an election speech, admittedly, but nonetheless, she said that there are 2 kinds of people in the country, Ramzadeh and Haramzadeh. Ramzadeh are worshippers of Ram, the Hindu god. Haramzadeh are bastards. So those are the only 2 choices you have for the kind of Indian you want to be. She should have been asked to resign on the spot. We all made a huge fuss in Parliament, but she continues. So you've got an egregious tolerance for the kind of talk that would not have been admissible in Indian politics till Mr. Modi's ascent to power.
Do you think India is in danger of succumbing to that kind of language, or do you feel it's still a very small minority?
I think it's a small minority, but it's dangerous that they're allowed to run as loose as they have. And I don't think they speak for a majority of Hindus. Hindus are a famously eclectic and tolerant people, so they're not going to put up with this kind of thing for much longer, I believe. And I think it'll cost them more votes than it'll consolidate.
If internal threats are one thing, obviously the other big issue in India today is the external threat, and your what's the word? Your half brother, Pakistan.
Brother enemy, I call them in the chapter of my book, Pax Indica. Pakistan, yeah.
Yeah. When I first went out to live in India as a young correspondent, things were often sort of, government run, shoddy, falling apart. You couldn't get foreign goods. And I remember going across the border to Pakistan to get things like Duracell batteries, Coca-Cola, all sorts of things you couldn't get in India. 25 years on,
It's all reversed.
India is now, however disappointing some of the recent growth has been, it is a fast-growing economy. A few years ago, it was growing each year by the size of the Pakistan economy, the total economy. And Pakistan, meanwhile, seems to be disintegrating into ever greater internal lacerations, with Taliban fighting the government, the ISI fighting the army. What do you see as the possible? Do you see any optimism there with Pakistan? It seems a very, very unhappy state at the moment.
It's very difficult to be optimistic, William, because there's an existential problem with Pakistan. As to paraphrase Voltaire on Prussia, in India, the state has an army. In Pakistan, the army has a state. And the army in Pakistan essentially needs to justify its grossly disproportionate share of national resources. No army in the world spends a larger percentage of that country's GDP or regular budget.
Do you know the figures? What are the figures?
I don't, but the official figures are 12% of the Pakistani budget. But in fact, there are lots of hidden elements as well that don't show up in the official figures, including the various clandestine services and the militancies that have been financed and even officered in many cases by the Pakistani official establishment. So you've got a state that has this problem, that wants to keep hostility going on both sides. Today's news is the much touted meeting of the two countries' national security advisors has been called off by Pakistan. So, they have an interest in hostility, and the civilian governments in Pakistan rather haplessly seek opportunities to make peace with India, because you can see the obvious advantages, not least economically. But the military draws the red lines, and since the military has ruled Pakistan for half its existence, it's difficult for any civilian leader who values his seat to not pay heed to the army's blandishments.
But some have argued that, without in any way whitewashing the Pakistani military establishment and what all the Faujis have done, some have argued that India is the big brother, as the much, much more powerful nation with a much larger population and the much larger army, in a sense should take the first step and go and go the extra mile.
We must. That's my view as well. I've argued in my book, Pax Indica, India and the World of the 21st Century, that we really should have an asymmetrical policy to Pakistan, should give them far more than we get. In fact, I'm all in favor of liberalizing as much as possible. But to give you one example, we unilaterally extended most favored nation treaty status to Pakistan, unilaterally, in 1995. 20 years later, Pakistan has still not reciprocated, so that we are the only example in the world of a one-sided most favored nation arrangement. So India makes these gestures with Pakistan, as I say, for them...
potentially for the future, if you were to get over this difficulty, there is such economic benefit for Pakistan.
Exactly.
in a trade relationship, an open road to Afghanistan, motorways up to Central Asia.
Possible pipeline from Iran through
all this
Pakistan,
stuff.
all of that. But they don't see that. They just...
But they would argue that
really
India is often... many of India's neighbours would argue that India has often been the big brother of the region, that it has bullied its neighbours, it has bullied Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, as well as Pakistan. Would you agree with that in the past?
Well, I think we haven't been blemish-free, but then ask the Mexicans what they think of the Americans.
But again, there's a measure of truth in both.
Yeah, but you look at South Asia, for example, the 7 countries plus India around the table, and India accounts for 70% of the population and 80% of the GDP of all these countries put together. Inevitably displaces more weight. I agree sometimes it perhaps has come across as somewhat heavy-handed, but it can and should, in my view, be far more generous to the neighbors, and I'm a prominent advocate of a more generous policy. In fact, very recently we signed a land boundary agreement with Bangladesh that ended some of the anomalies of partition. And we did so on terms that were far more generous to Bangladesh than to India, but it was the right thing to do. And as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, I steered it through my committee unanimously.
I should say at this point that Shashi has written a book on his view on foreign relations, Pax Indica, which isn't available in the bookshop, but is available on Amazon.
This bookshop had a bit of bad luck, unfortunately, getting some of my books, but there's, I think, one volume which I edited rather than wrote that's available, but the rest are online, yes.
We're reaching the end of our time, but looking forward, looking to the future, Aravind Adiga wrote in a review recently that he thought that India's biggest problem was overconfidence, that it already believed that it was on the verge of becoming a superpower when there was a huge amount of work to be done. You'd probably agree with that, wouldn't you?
Well, I think some have been boosting beyond the sort of the reach of reason. It doesn't really make sense for us to imply that we are capable of some sort of superpowerdom, as I said earlier. But also, I think it's important for us as a country to recognize that there's simply too much wrong for us to be complacent. That we have a large number of internal problems to settle. And even whether we grow at 9% or 7% or whatever percent we come up with, we still have to worry about that bottom 25% of our society who are living in conditions, below a poverty line drawn barely this side of the funeral pyre. So there's an enormous amount that needs to be done. And I think if we can focus on those problems first, we can worry about projecting ourselves in other ways later. And I think these problems have to be focused on.
Just to embarrass you before I let loose the questions, many would argue that you have in the BJP a party that's come to power partly because your party, the Congress Party, which in so many ways has views that we should all agree with. It's plural. It's in a whole variety of ways. It has wonderful ideals, and yet it has this, many would argue, appalling leadership. That the Gandhi family have run it into the ground. That Rahul is a fool. That Sonia acts undemocratically. And would you want to defend them?
Yes, I would, most certainly. No, look, the Congress Party...
And more specifically, she hasn't allowed a new generation to come up and fill... I mean, you are now heading towards your...
Yes, grand old years.
Grand old years.
Eligible for senior
not as young as you once were, and should be now sort of foreign minister, I mean, in a just world.
Well, in a just world, we should be in power, and then I could have a crack at that. But no, the truth is that the Congress Party does actually have far more talent in its ranks than the BJP does, as is painfully apparent during Parliament question hour. You can see the ministers are literally in over their heads for the most part, with a handful of exceptions in the BJP. The Congress Party, therefore, is not dependent on one leader to the extent the BJP is. It has a depth of leadership, and it's a consensual leadership that the Gandhi family is trying to bring forward. Secondly, the generational change you talk about is, I think, imminent. I mean, I don't know when, but I expect in a matter of months rather than years, you will see a younger generation taking over the reins, and that will probably feature Rahul Gandhi as the president, but with a cohort of
Does that fill you with delight, that prospect?
He's really had a bum rap, as the Americans say in the press. He really isn't the person who's caricatured in the press. He's actually smart, intellectually curious, fairly charismatic, very good looking, attracts young people wherever he goes. And he has
this is the first moment where I'm beginning to
you're beginning to
lose faith in your judgment, Shashi.
Listen, mark my words, the electorate will prove us right.
I won't argue with you with the British Empire, but I can't have you say that about Rahul, whose performance on television in his first television debate, he repeated the same line 11 times. We want to introduce young people and bring more women. And it was as if he was on drugs or something. What was going on there?
Let me say that everyone's entitled to a horror story in their political past. But the Rahul who has been campaigning through the country in the last 3 or 4 months has really made a tremendous impact. I suspect you've been away for part of that time, Willie, but in all fairness, I've seen him strike the right note repeatedly. I've seen him do it in Parliament, where he's been far more eloquent than in the past. I think he's really coming into his own, and I think he's actually going to get stronger and more effective as we've seen in the last few months, in the years ahead. So,
And is it a
if
good
I were
thing
Modi,
that
I would worry.
that the same party, that your party, this great party that's done so much in Indian history, started, of course, by a Scot,
Yes,
Octavian
indeed.
Hume,
Alan Octavian Hume,
should be led by
1885.
only one family?
No, but you see, the family's claim to that leadership is partly historic, that is, the DNA of the party being inextricably linked with the Nehrus and Gandhis. But it's also partly their electoral appeal. I mean, whether we like it or not, and I recognize that some of you don't like it, the fact that a Gandhi is coming and seeking votes actually sways an awful lot of voters.
It didn't last time. It drove them away.
Well, that's true, but the fact is that we've won elections every time we've lost a couple, we will come back and won the next few. So the feeling is that that you know, a change of personnel in terms of generation, but a continuation of the same brand, as it were, will actually serve the party well. Now, it has to be tested at the ballot box. That's a wonderful thing about democracy. So let's see whether I'm right or you are.
And if he fails again next time, would you vote to throw him out, to throw a palace coup or something, Shashi, or what?
You know that sitting on the stage and discussing hypotheticals is not a very wise thing to do, particularly the video camera rolling.
Luckily, I think.
But let me say that we expect to win the next election, so the question will not
Ladies and
arise.
gentlemen, Shashi Tharoor.
Thank you very much.
Do we have time for a few questions? They say finish, but that means I think 2 quick questions. Please, one person challenge Shashi on Empire. Any Tweedy
4 or 5 hands
Empire
up,
nostalgists? Andrew, no.
I'm not mentioning the Empire, but we're in the year of the 50th anniversary of the 1965 Indo-Pakistan War, and there's some plans for a jamboree on the date of the end of the war by the Indians, which has caused some controversy. And I just wondered, in the context of the fact that I read an academic the other day talking about how it's in China's interest to have, you know, if you've got the bigger brother India and the smaller brother Pakistan, then China likes to see itself as a parent with the bickering children. It's actually in their interest to have that going on. I just wondered, in your capacity as heading up the Committee on Foreign Relations, can you just talk a little bit about the relationship with China?
Yes, the relationship with China is actually hugely important, and it's a very interesting example of something that I wish the Pakistanis would do vis-a-vis us. We lost a war to China in '62 in rather humiliating ways, and we have the world's longest disputed frontier between our two countries. But we have agreed, and we are the aggrieved party, to put that on the back burner and develop other kinds of normal relations with China. So our trade has gone up 250 times in the last 24 years, since 1991, to the point where China is now, if you discount services, if you just discount manufactured goods, they're our largest single trading partner. It's about $70 billion of trade every year with China. And we're now taking steps to improve, to make it easier for the Chinese to come and invest in our economy, give them more of a stake in India's prosperity.
They're now your biggest trading partner, aren't they? Yeah.
I mean, the US is really, because you add both goods and services, but in goods alone, China is first. So when you look at all of this, there is no question that this is an important relationship. At the same time, there are tensions arising from the unresolved frontier dispute, and occasionally provocative statements from the Chinese side laying claim to an Indian state, Arunachal Pradesh, which they prefer to call South Tibet. And this is obviously something that we are sensitive to, and which will create, if you like, a certain level of geopolitical and geostrategic concern between the two countries. We will see, and we'll continue to see, China as a potential threat as long as this dispute remains unresolved. But China seems to not be in a big hurry to settle it. They've had something like 17 rounds of talks between envoys, the two countries, on the border, and there's very little progress. But at the moment, we believe that we are sufficiently well prepared that the Chinese will not embark on a military adventure. And meanwhile, trade and travel and investment and tourism can all grow.
Kirsty.
Thank you. It's very interesting. It's a topic you've not spoken about, and that is sexual violence towards women in India. It was obviously very much highlighted by the terrible rape and murder of Jyoti Singh on the bus in December 2012 in Delhi. What are you doing about that sort of general issue of how women are treated?
Right. Well, first of all, this is a genuine problem. It's right to highlight it. But it's also true that it's probably not as much worse as it's portrayed as being. It's simply that people are much more willing to talk about it now. I think a lot of these things were happening in the past and were brushed under the carpet. Now we are beginning to face our own demons. And so the awareness of it is itself partly a step towards tackling the problem of violence against women. Now, every rape gets reported. I'm afraid in the past, many women were too ashamed to go and report rape to the police, and many police were reluctant to record it, and investigations were lackadaisical and so on and so forth. That climate has changed now. Now we're determined as a society to do something about it. This tragedy happened when my party's government was in power. And we had a very clear strategy. We dramatically rewrote the laws to increase punitive action against rapists and criminals. We redefined rape to make permissible a whole lot of activities which in the past were getting off far too lightly from our judicial system. We launched a campaign to have rape crisis centers in every state, and we also created all women's police stations, or at least women police cells in police stations, so women could go and report to a woman officer if they wanted to complain about
Some
this.
would argue that you overreacted, and that some. I mean, for example, if I make according to the law, if I make a sexual gesture at a woman, if I give somebody the finger in the street, I can go to jail for 3 years on the current law.
The law is very tough, but it's a law passed by Parliament unanimously. The present government was party to it, so we'll see. I mean, the thing again is how effectively these things are implemented. It's early days yet. The incident you talked about was December 2012. The law was passed in April of 2013 or March of 2013, and we're now in the middle of 2015. But in the meantime, there's been a change of government. And one of the things that I, for example, have objected to in Parliament is how the budget for the rape centres has been slashed by this government to meet their fiscal targets. And so we're finding that some of the objectives, they still declare the same objectives as our government did, but they're not prepared to finance them as effectively as ours had. And this worries me. But consciousness is up, and there are these specific measures on that. There's a lot more that can be done and should be done.
One last quick question, a short one, front here.
Right, thanks for that. That's the longest I've heard an Indian MP been speaking and not been interrupted, actually. So,
Thank you, Willie.
My question is about the aspirations of India in terms of securing a permanent seat in the UN, actually, and that's been talked about so many times. So, the reason why I asked this question is obviously we don't see India talk about foreign affairs or in a more prominent way now what's happening in the Middle East or Syria or anywhere. When we don't do that, how can we keep doing the other side? And I ask for that to happen.
Right. Well, I don't know how familiar all of you are with this issue. There's been a demand for some years now to reform the UN Security Council for obvious reasons. First of all, the council is relatively small. When it was set up, it was 11 members out of a total UN membership of 51, so 22% of the UN was on it. Now it's 15 members out of a total UN membership of 193, so barely 8%. Secondly, Europe, with 5% of the world's population, has 33% of the seats on the council, and much as we love the Europeans, that does seem slightly unfair. And thirdly, there are 5 permanent members who happen to be there because they happen to have won a war 70 years ago, which is no longer a good enough reason to leave them in that position without others who have contributed as much to world affairs in the years since the Second World War. So a number of countries, initially was Japan and Germany, who clamored for reform. Then the developing countries started saying, we're doing a lot too for the UN, contributions to peacekeeping operations and all of that. And essentially, if the concept of permanent membership is to have the countries without which the UN would not be credible, in other words, the indispensable countries, then surely a country like India, it is argued, should be a permanent member. Well, the problem is that the UN Charter has to be amended, and the threshold for amending that charter is so high that the second and third largest contributors to the UN, Japan and Germany, are still called enemy states in the charter because it's too much of a problem to amend the charter. Now, this charter requires a 2/3 majority in the General Assembly, 128 countries, to agree to a formula. And then it has to be ratified by 128 parliaments, including those of all 5 permanent members. So you need a formula that is acceptable to 2/3 of the world and is not unacceptable to the very countries whose powers would be diluted by a reform. You can imagine how how almost impossible that task is. So yes, one could argue that India should be on the council. The Japanese and the Germans say they should be on the council too. And one Italian foreign minister rather memorably cracked, what's all this talk about Japan and Germany? We lost the war too. So, many countries are objecting. How do we, Brazil and Latin America, well, the Argentinians and the Mexicans don't like it. How do you choose in Africa? From the largest democracy, Nigeria, the largest economy, South Africa, and the oldest civilization, Egypt. So it becomes a difficult task, and as a result, there's been no consensus. Boutros Ghali, the Secretary General in 1992, said that he hoped that the UN Security Council would be reformed in time for the 50th anniversary of the United Nations. This year we mark the 70th, and we're no closer to UN reform. So I think this is a question that will remain of academic interest for some time to come. But I do worry, and I say this not just as an Indian, but as a UN lifer. I spent 29 years at the UN. And to my mind, if the Security Council is not reformed, the credibility of some of its decisions will sadly go down. Imagine, for example, sanctions being imposed on, say, one of the South Asian countries with which India has extensive trade without India being consulted. Will India feel like honoring those sanctions when it directly affects its own economy? And you can extrapolate that story to, say, a Brazilian situation or a South African situation. The fact is that if the Council wants to be credible and to uphold the principles of international law, it needs to adjust and accommodate itself to the changes, the geopolitical realities of 2015 rather than 1945. That's my concern. If it doesn't happen and the Council becomes less credible, the legitimacy of its decisions will be questioned, and all of us who benefited from the world order created in 1945 with the Security Council of the UN as its linchpin, if you like, that world order itself, I think, will come seriously into question. And that's my big worry. It's something we should talk about in future sessions of Beyond Borders. Already you're seeing the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, simply unable to accommodate the legitimate aspirations of an economy like China, let alone India. China has the same weighted vote in these institutions as Belgium. It's a joke, because these rules were written in 1945. Now, if you don't accommodate them, what happens? What the Chinese and the Indians and the others will say is, give us a level playing field, and if you won't, we'll go and construct our own playing field. And so you're seeing the new BRICS bank coming up and the new infrastructure bank coming up with the Chinese. And the result is quite likely that the international order we all rightly prize and celebrate will collapse, not because anyone is really challenging it. This is not like the rise of Germany and Japan in the late 19th, early 20th century. It's because of the lack of imagination of the leaders of the existing system in their failure to accommodate these rising powers who simply want a place at the high table. They're not trying to overturn the table. They're saying, just make a little room for us in the chairs around the table. And we're not getting it. And that is something, I think, that potentially worries me, because I am a great believer in the UN and in international organizations. And I think the world has been well served for 70 years. But it needs some imagination and some statesmanlike spirit to ensure that it continues to serve us all well in the decades to come.
Ladies and gentlemen, Shashi Tharoor.
Thank you.